welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. I'm Jason Kishinev, and we are starting the conclusion, which we'll have to do over 2 episodes because it's kind of long, of An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you like the show, please do me a favor and hit that like and subscribe button. And if you hit the notification bell, you'll be notified when I make a new video, because YouTube, well, it has been known to unsubscribe people that watch things like this show. Alright, but without further ado, let's dig in. The conclusion, the future of the United States, starts off with a quotation that the continued colonization of American Indian nations, peoples, and lands provides the United States the economic and material resources needed to cast its imperialist gaze globally is a fact that is simultaneously obvious within and yet continually obscured by what is essentially a settler colony's national construction of itself as an ever more perfect, multicultural, multiracial democracy. The status of American Indians as sovereign nations colonized by the United States continues to haunt and inflect its raison d'etre. Jody Bird. The conventional narrative of U.S. history routinely segregates the Indian Wars as a subspecialization within the dubious category, the West. Then there are the Westerns, those cheap novels, movies, and television shows that nearly every U.S. American imbibed with mother's milk, and that by the mid-20th century were popular in every corner of the world, especially Italy. The architecture of U.S. world dominance was designed and tested by this period of continental U.S. militarism, which built on the previous 100 years and generated its own innovations in total war. The opening of the 21st century, this century, saw a new, even more brazen form of U.S. militarism and imperialism explode on the world scene when the election of George W. Bush turned over control of U.S. foreign policy to a long gestating neoconservative and warmongering faction of the Pentagon and its civilian hawks. That right there is why YouTube might unsubscribe you. Their subsequent 8 years of political control included 2 major military invasions and hundreds of small wars employing U.S. special forces around the globe. Hundreds of small wars, establishing a template that continued after their political power waned. Yes, it did. Indian country. One highly regarded military analyst stepped forward to make the connections between the Indian Wars and what he considered the country's bright imperialist past and future. Robert D. Kaplan, in his 2005 book Imperial Grunts, presented several case studies that he considered highly successful operations: Yemen, Colombia, Mongolia, and the Philippines, in addition to ongoing complex projects in the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, and Iraq. That's right, we're in the Horn of Africa. You didn't know? If you did, Or if you didn't, put it in the comments. Let's take a little poll. While U.S. citizens and many of their elected representatives called for ending the U.S. military interventions they knew about, including Iraq and Afghanistan, Kaplan hailed protracted counterinsurgencies in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Pacific. He presented a guide for the U.S. controlling those areas of the world based on its having achieved continental dominance in North America by means of counterinsurgency and employing total and unlimited war. Kaplan, a meticulous researcher and influential writer born in 1952 in New York City, wrote for major newspapers and magazines before serving as chief geopolitical strategist for the private security think tank Stratfor. Among other prestigious posts, he has been a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C., and a member of the Defense Policy Board, a federal advisory committee to the U.S. Department of Defense. In 2011, Foreign Policy magazine, there's actually a magazine named that, Foreign Policy magazine named Kaplan as one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. Author of numerous best-selling books including Balkan Ghosts and Surrender or Starve, Kaplan became one of the principal intellectual boosters for U.S. power in the world through the tried and true American way of war. This is the way of war dating to the British colonial period that military historian John Grenier called a combination of irregular war and unlimited war. Actually, unlimited war and irregular war, but who's keeping track? A military tradition that accepted, legitimized, and encouraged attacks upon and the destruction of non-combatants, villages, and agricultural resources in shockingly violent campaigns to achieve their goals of conquest. Kaplan sums up this thesis in the prologue to Imperial Grunts, which he subtitles Indian Country. By the turn of the 21st century, the United States military had already appropriated the entire Earth and was ready to flood the most obscure areas of it with troops at a moment's notice. The Pentagon divided the planet into 5 area commands. You thought I was joking? I wasn't joking. The Pentagon divided the planet into 5 area commands, similar to the way that the Indian country of the American West had been divided in the mid-19th century by the U.S. Army. According to the soldiers and Marines I met on the ground in far-flung corners of the earth, the comparison with the 19th century was apt. "Welcome to Indian Country," was the refrain I heard from troops from Colombia to the Philippines, including Afghanistan and Iraq. To be sure, the problem for the American military was less Islamic fundamentalism than anarchy. The war on terrorism was really about taming the frontier. Kaplan goes on to ridicule elites in New York and Washington who debate imperialism in grand historical terms, while individuals from all the armed services interpret policy according to the particular circumstances they face and are indifferent to or unaware of the fact that they are part of an imperialist project. This book shows how colonialism and imperialism work. Kaplan challenges the concept of manifest destiny, arguing that it was not inevitable that the United States should have an empire in the western part of the continent. Rather, he argues, Western Empire was brought about by small groups of frontiersmen separated from each other by great distances. Here Kaplan refers to what Grenier calls settler rangers, destroying indigenous towns and fields and food supplies. Although Kaplan downplays the role of the U.S. Army compared to the settler vigilantes, which he equates to the modern special forces, he acknowledges that the regular army provided lethal backup for settler counterinsurgency in slaughtering the buffalo, the food supply of plains peoples, as well as making continuous raids on settlements to kill or confine the families of the indigenous fighters. Kaplan summarizes the genealogy of U.S. militarism today. Whereas the average American at the dawn of the new millennium found patriotic inspiration in the legacies of the Civil War and World War II, when the evils of slavery and fascism were confronted and vanquished for many commissioned and non-commissioned officers, the U.S. Army's defining moment was fighting the Indians. The legacy of the Indian Wars was palpable in the numerous military bases spread across the South, the Midwest, and particularly the Great Plains. That vast desert and steppe comprising the Army's historical heartland, punctuated by such storied outposts as Fort Hays, Kearney, Leavenworth, Riley, and Sill. Leavenworth, where the Oregon and Santa Fe trails separated, was now the home of the Army Command and General Staff College. Riley, the base of General Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, now that of the 1st Infantry Division, and Sill, where Geronimo lived out the last years of his life, the headquarters of the U.S. Artillery. While microscopic in size, it was the fast and irregular military actions against the Indians, memorialized in bronze and oil by Remington, that shaped the nature of American nationalism. Although Kaplan relies principally on the late 19th century source of U.S. counterinsurgency, in a footnote he reports that he learned at the Airborne Special Operations Museum in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It is a small but interesting fact that members of the 101st Airborne Division, in preparation for their parachute drop on D-Day, shaved themselves in Mohawk style and applied war paint on their faces. This takes us back to the pre-independence colonial wars and then through U.S. independence and the myth popularized by the last of the Mohicans. Kaplan debunks the argument that the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, brought the United States into a new era of warfare and prompted it to establish military bases around the world. Prior to 2001, Kaplan rightly observes the U.S. Army's Special Operations Command had been carrying out maneuvers since the 1980s in 170 countries per year. 170 countries per year, with an average of 9 quiet professionals on each mission. America's reach was long. Its involvement in the obscurest states, Protean, rather than the conscript army of citizen soldiers that fought World War II, there was now a professional military that, true to other imperial forces throughout history, enjoyed the soldiering life for its own sake. On October 13, 2011, testifying before the Armed Services Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, General Martin Dempsey started, "I didn't become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to oversee the decline of the armed forces of the United States and an end state that would have this nation and its military not be a global power. That is not who we are as a nation." The return of legalized torture. Bodies. Tortured bodies. Sexually violated bodies. Imprisoned bodies. Dead bodies arose as a primary topic in the first years of the George W. Bush administration following the September 2001 attacks with the War of Revenge against Afghanistan and the overthrow of the government of Iraq. Afghans resisting U.S. forces and others who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time were taken into custody, and most of them were sent to a hastily constructed prison facility on the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, on lands the United States appropriated in its 1898 war against Cuba. Rather than bestowing the status of prisoner of war on the detainees, which would have given them certain rights under the Geneva Conventions, they were designated as unlawful combatants, a status previously unknown in the annals of Western warfare. As such, the detainees were subjected to torture by U.S. interrogators and shamelessly monitored by civilian psychologists and medical personnel. In response to questions and condemnations from around the globe, a University of California international law professor, John C. Yoo, on leave to serve as Assistant U.S. Attorney General in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, penned in March 2003 what became the infamous torture memo. Not much was made at the time of one of the precedents Yoo used to defend the designation unlawful combatant, the U.S. Supreme Court's 1873 opinion in Modoc Indian prisoners. In 1872, a group of Modoc men led by the Kintpwash, also known as Captain Jack, attempted to return to their own country in Northern California after the U.S. Army had rounded them up and forced them to share a reservation in Oregon. The insurgent group of 53 was surrounded by U.S. troops and Oregon militiamen and forced to take refuge in the barren and rugged lava beds around Lassen Peak, a dormant volcano, a part of their ancestral homeland that they knew every inch of. More than 1,000 troops commanded by General Edward R.S. Canby, a former Civil War general, attempted to capture the resistors but had no success as the Modocs engaged in effective guerrilla warfare. Before the Civil War, Canby had built his military career fighting in the Second Seminole War and later in the invasion of Mexico. Posted to Utah on the eve of the Civil War, he had led attacks against the Navajos and then began his Civil War service in New Mexico. Therefore, Canby was a seasoned Indian killer. In a negotiating meeting between the general and Kintpwash, the Modoc leader killed the general and the other commissioners when they would only allow for surrender. In response, the United States sent another former Civil War general with more than 1,000 additional soldiers as reinforcements. And in April 1873, these troops attacked the Modoc stronghold, this time forcing the indigenous fighters to flee. After 4 months of fighting that cost the United States almost $500,000, equal to nearly $10 million currently, and the lives of more than 400 of its soldiers in general and a general, the nationwide backlash against the Modocs was vengeful. Kintpoash and several other captured Modocs were imprisoned and then hanged at Alcatraz, and the Modoc families were scattered and incarcerated on reservations. Kintpoash's corpse was embalmed and exhibited at circuses around the country. That's really disturbing, isn't it? The commander of the Army's Pacific Military Division at the time, Lieutenant General John M. Schofield, wrote of the Modoc War in his memoir, 46 Years in the Army. If the innocent could become separated from the guilty, plague, pestilence, and famine would not be an unjust punishment for the crimes committed in this country against the original occupants of the soil. During a legal analogy between the Modoc prisoners and the Guantanamo detainees, Assistant U.S. Attorney General Yu employed the legal category of homo sacer, S-A-C-E-R. In Roman law, a person banned from society. Okay, homo sacer. In Roman law, a person banned from society, excluded from its legal protections, but still subject to the sovereign's power. In other words, you gotta pay taxes. Anyone may kill a homo sacer. I've never heard that term. Anyone may kill a homo sacer without it being considered murder. As Jody Bird notes, one begins to understand why John C. Yu's infamous March 14, 2003 torture memos cited the 1865 military commissions and the 1873 the Modoc American prisoners' legal opinions in order to articulate executive power in declaring the state of exception, particularly when the Modoc Indian prisoner's opinion explicitly marks the Indian combatant as homo sacer in the United States. To buttress his claim, Yu quoted from the 1873 Modoc Indian prisoner's opinion. It cannot be pretended that a United States soldier is guilty of murder if he kills a public enemy in battle, which would be the case if the municipal law were in force and applicable to an act committed under such circumstances. All the laws and customs of civilized warfare may not be applicable to an armed conflict with the Indian tribes upon our western frontier, but the circumstances attending the assassinations of Canby, the Attorney General, and Thomas, the U.S. Peace Commissioner, are such as to make their murder as much a violation of the laws of savage as of civilized warfare, and the Indians concerned in it fully understood the baseness and treachery of their act. Bird points out that according to this line of thinking, anyone who could be identified as Indian could thus be killed legally, and they also could be held responsible for crimes they committed against any U.S. soldier. As a result, citizens of American Indian nations become in this moment the origin of the stateless terrorist combatant within U.S. enunciations of sovereignty. U.S. stateless terrorist combatant. Should we push on or end the episode? Let's end the episode there. We'll pick it up in the next episode. We'll finish up the conclusion. I know I keep saying I don't want to promise that, but we'll finish it in the next episode. Thanks for joining me. Hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.